Thanks, Anthony, very much for your kind introduction and for the invitation to have this conversation here today. I'm very happy to be able to talk to Erin about her new book, Seeing Like an Activist, which just came out in the United States and soon will be available in Europe as well. We're here to talk about Erin's book and about issues of civil disobedience more generally. And it's probably on all of your minds as well, because joining us from all over the world, I'm seeing in the chat people are from, joining from Brazil, from Arizona, from other European countries. Welcome, everyone. Civil disobedience is back on the agenda in many of these places, right? I mean, protest movements from Black Lives Matter to the climate justice movement, anti-austerity movements, and so on have used civil disobedience very prominently in their protest actions. And obviously today there are just as many reasons to engage in protest and in civil disobedience as in the period in which the civil rights movement, which Erin's book primarily focuses on, has been active. At the same time, civil disobedience has also returned as a topic of philosophical discussion for some time. In the 60s and 70s, it was a very prominent topic of philosophical discussion, but then philosophers sort of turned away from it. But now political theorists and philosophers are again paying attention, precisely because it's back on the political agenda. And there are a lot of theoretical questions that arise in the context of activism, from questions of definition: what is civil disobedience? How is it different from other forms of protest, both legal and more radical maybe, to questions of justification. Under which conditions is it legitimate, and so on, to issues about the role of civil disobedience within more or less democratic systems. And one of the examples that is very often mentioned in this context is, of course, the American civil rights movement, and more specifically the example of Martin Luther King Jr. And I mean, Martin Luther King wrote a lot, but usually people only quote from one or two famous classical writings, just such as the letter from Birmingham City Jail. Now, Erin's book is part of what one could call a new wave of theorizing civil disobedience and thinking about its much more complicated history and present, much more complicated because it complicates philosophical discussions and conventional framings of the concept, its justification, both in theory, but also in the broader public. And I think it's a really great example of that new literature that just shows us how complex the world of protest is and what theory can learn from the complexity of that practice. Erin's book shows how this very iconic, but very often also misunderstood example of civil disobedience in the civil rights movement, how this can still be made productive, as it were, today for thinking about our current constellation, recovering its radical and in some ways even a revolutionary potential. Now, the book is very complex. We can't talk about everything here, of course. I really urge you to get your hands on it as soon as it's out in your region of the world. You will learn a lot, I can promise that. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I want to start with the title. The book is called Seeing Like an Activist. And Erin, maybe you could tell us a bit about the choice of that title and the methodological choice that stands behind it. I mean, it's a critique of mainstream political theory, especially of what is called liberalism. And it's kind of very narrow perspective that has been hegemonic in political theory for quite some time. Maybe it's no longer hegemonic, and which you describe as seeing like a state, or even seeing like a white state. That's what you think political theorists have, for the most part, been doing. And you urge us to see like an activist. How does that work, and what does it actually mean for you?
Thanks so much for that generous introduction, Robin, and for that question. And thank you all for coming, and to Anthony Morgan for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I guess as a way of answering the question about the title and what I mean by that, I'll say a little bit about how the project unfolded maybe for me, and what I envision or what I mean by seeing like an activist versus other ways that we might see civil disobedience. So funny enough, I mean, when first started on this project, I didn't at all expect to focus on the civil rights movement at all, at least not exclusively. I was writing in 2011, 2012, thinking a lot about the Arab Spring, about Occupy Wall Street, and the kind of modes of direct action and civil disobedience and other forms of protest that were current and happening globally in that moment. And my thought, kind of in line with some of the work that other recent democratic theorists have been doing on this topic, my thought was that while it might have been at one point the case that the civil rights movement provided a kind of model for civil disobedience, it might no longer be the case. The world has changed substantially. The kinds of structures that activists are confronting might require different forms of action and different meanings that are attributed to those actions. But once I started diving in, I got fascinated by something else that I noted, or that I saw in the literature. So one side of it is the way that sort of mainstream liberal and democratic philosophies of civil disobedience, many of which emerged in the 1960s and 70s, interacted with and used the example of the civil rights movement. So the way that they saw the civil rights movement. And so I really wanted to understand the frameworks that they used, because the model that I saw reflected back at me didn't seem to share, it seemed, there seemed to be a gap between what I was seeing as the representation of the civil rights movement reflected back in mainstream philosophy, and then what I knew sociologically and historically about the movement. And I wanted to better understand that gap. And so what I try to suggest in the book is that liberal and democratic philosophers in the 60s and 70s who went on to create these quite influential theories of civil disobedience, they were really interested and invested in the civil rights movement. They were sympathetic to its aims and its tactics, and they really sought to defend the movement from conservative critiques that things like civil disobedience would only breed lawlessness and would actually result in the breakdown of democratic constitutional orders. And so in being politically motivated in this way, one of the things they did is that they took up this question about whether or not citizens have an obligation to obey the law. And they wanted to theorize that obligation in such a way that there would still be room for something like civil disobedience within democratic liberal societies. And so what I argue is that in sort of adopting that framework and seeing the movement with that set of motivations in mind, from within the framework of insisting that citizens of certain kinds of states have binding obligations to obey the law, they did a couple of interesting things that I think is distorting or gives a particular spin on the movement. One of which is that they treated the movement itself, I think, as a kind of object lesson, maybe, or a proof of concept. So that they drew on to a certain limited extent the actions of civil rights protesters or texts like Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail as a kind of piece of evidence for the purchase of these bigger theories of an obligation to obey the law. And then they interpreted the movement as sort of neatly explicable within the terms of this larger theoretical framework. And I think several things come out of that. What this way of seeing contributes, or the way that it shapes the interpretation of the movement, is that they centered as primary, as a primary good, the stability and the maintenance of the constitutional order. They tended to take it for granted that the context about which they were to some extent writing about, the US in the 1960s, was already meaningfully democratic. And so they wanted to theorize civil disobedience as this kind of limited exception to an otherwise legitimate, fairly healthy democratic order. And this causes them, I think, to theorize racial injustice, the problem of racial domination, in a really narrow, specific way, a kind of relatively anomalous, purely domestic form of exclusion. Relatively anomalous because it didn't actually affect or seriously threaten the overall legitimacy and the integrity of the constitutional order. And this frame, I think, really fully shapes the way that they see civil disobedience unfolding, the kind of normative meaning that they ascribe to it, the way that the kinds of limitations that they put on its use, the kinds of actions that it becomes associated with. And then I think maybe most problematically, they tend to impute this view to the activists that they are to some extent writing about, the civil rights activists themselves. And so it's this tangle of issues that I call seeing like a white state in the book. This way of assuming as primary these particular ends, and then sort of slotting the civil rights movement within this framework. So then the question for me methodologically was how do I think about it otherwise? If I don't find that to be an adequate characterization of what was going on, what are my alternatives? So methodologically speaking, the kind of commitment that I made was, rather than try to view civil disobedience, re-theorize it from a different theoretical angle, the question becomes, what are the frameworks and vantage points, the kinds of questions that activists themselves pose? How do we think about them as engaging in political theorizing itself? The idea there being that in order for activists to identify a problem for themselves, come to a sort of set of shared terms about what the problem of racial domination is, how it functions, how it shapes subjects, how it shapes relations, how it shapes institutions, and then forge a sort of course of action to remediate in some way or to transform those structures. That already sounds like the work of political theorizing, sort of abstracting away from the messy, complicated reality of political life to describe forms of domination and then theorize forms of action that do various, that have various effects on the world. And so that alternative vantage point is what I try to adopt for myself in the book, trying to see civil disobedience from this alternative perspective.
Great, thanks. So maybe to flesh this out a bit, it's useful to look at a specific feature that is often taken to be central to civil disobedience. I mean, obviously there are many definitions, but it's pretty standard to think that civil disobedience is non-violent or purely symbolic, that it serves a kind of appeal function, appealing to the public, appealing to the majority to reconsider, and that it does seek change, but within the existing order, or while accepting the general legitimacy of the political and legal system. And one of the ways in which this acceptance of the legitimacy of the political system is often taken to be expressed is the readiness to accept the legal consequences of one's breaking the law, right? Because civil disobedience always involves breaking the law. That differentiates it from legal protests, demonstrations, etc., that are legal. And so many liberal theorists think that this readiness to accept the consequences, to not evade arrest, not evade the trial, not evade punishment, that this is important to signal one's continuing loyalty to the constitutional order, and also to underline the seriousness of one's intention. It's a kind of moral authentication, right? You're not just doing this because you're an anarchist and or have a kind of irrational desire to smash things, but you're actually a serious political agent, an exemplary citizen in some way, and that's why you get yourself arrested, go to court, and then go to jail. And in some ways, we find such claims in the writings of King as well, and it has a certain basis in how the civil rights movement operated. Putting a public display on in which indeed you don't try to evade arrest, but get yourself arrested and go to court, use the courtroom for certain political purposes, and maybe even go to jail. So what's wrong with the liberal picture, and how does seeing like an activist help us maybe see what is wrong with it and provide an alternative perspective on how these issues of loyalty and accepting punishment should be reconsidered?
That's a great question. And so, I mean, I think you phrased it exactly right, or the way that you set up the question is exactly the way that I would think about it, which is that, what's formative there in the kind of liberal perspective is the idea that the constitutional order is democratic, is legitimate, and ought to be maintained, and that activists themselves have a primary interest in maintaining it because it's the guarantor of their rights as well as the rights of others. It's, it's the guarantor of their democratic citizenship as well as that of others. And so because of that, there are all of these either limitations or these particular forms of action that a true, sincere civil disobedient would want to or even must take up in order to outwardly communicate those ends. So John Rawls suggests that it's not an easy thing to be taken as sincere by your fellow citizens. The sincerity of your actions can immediately be read off of them. So activists have to find ways of communicating that sincerity, as well as communicating the kind of limited intervention that's intended, that this is maybe dramatic, maybe disruptive, but it's intended in a kind of reformist gesture, that this is intended in a full democratic spirit to reform or remediate real injustices that all citizens should have an interest in addressing, but that the point isn't to tear down, it's to reform. And so, a couple of things that I would say about that framework. One is that it might in some places be true. I wouldn't want to deny that you could easily find examples in which activists expressed themselves that way, adopted those ends as their own, saw their own actions in that way. It just, I think, is a problematic reading of the civil rights movement. And I do think many other movements. It can't be, it cannot be the theory of civil disobedience, particularly if we take seriously the idea that the states that we call liberal democracies are nevertheless built on all of these nested forms of domination that make people substantively and often also formally unfree within them. And so from that perspective, I think it becomes problematic to say, well, this is how civil disobedience works in these states that we call liberal democracies, and there are particular strictures because everybody knows what these states are and everybody knows they're different. And then there's, perhaps all rules or all bets are off in these other contexts, in colonial contexts, in authoritarian contexts. So one problem that I think is quite significant for that framework is just that activists themselves often speak across those contexts, borrow tactics, cultivate ethical language amongst each other. So one of the things that I try to do in the book is show a way in which civil disobedience emerged, not just within the civil rights movement, but within a civil rights movement that was deeply in conversation with and tied to anti-colonial movements around the world, and for which, for at least some set of actors, the language of radical nonviolence and civil disobedience became a shared language and a shared framework. It was not essentially, they did not see the world as bifurcated into democratic states and everywhere else. That was not the thing that shaped their vision. But even, thinking within the domestic context in the example that you brought up about accepting arrest and accepting punishment, I think there are often alternative ways of understanding what those tactics might mean. So in the book, I look at the student sit-in movements of 1960 and 1961, and as well as the freedom rides of 1961, and look at the practices of accepting jail and accepting arrest that come out of those years. And what I think those examples show is that, first of all, something interesting happens historically, which is that activists allowed themselves to be arrested, but then they choose to serve out jail sentences rather than accepting bail. And so from the kind of liberal perspective, we can say, well, yes, this is just the way that they are showing their sincerity. They're choosing the harsher of the two punishments in order to show their investment in the cause, perhaps, but also they're still accepting punishment, they're accepting arrest. And so that kind of signals an investment in the legitimacy of the legal system. But looking through the archival documents and sort of trying to trace out the strategic and ethical conversations that activists were having amongst themselves, what I find is that one of the primary languages, one of the ways in which they talk about why it's important to accept arrest and then choose jail rather than bail, what they call jail no bail, was that this was the way of signaling their on the one hand, signaling their deep break with the legal architecture of Jim Crow, which they understood to be national and in these other ways, actually international in scope. And so the depth of the break was such that they refused to contribute funds to it. By accepting bail, they would have been paying their jailers, paying their captors, paying into the system of Jim Crow justice. And so their attempt then was to announce a much more radical critique of the system than I think the liberal account really gives them credit for. But also quite meaningfully, when they talked about why it was important to go to jail and what could happen by going to jail, there's quite a lot there that is not like very far from the language of signaling a kind of investment in the legitimacy of the system. They're using this evocative language of self-emancipation and self-liberation, that there is something powerfully materially and symbolically important about showing courage and fearlessness and a kind of refusal to comply within what was kind of the epicenter of Jim Crow racial violence, which is the Southern jail, which is not just a site of the kind of legal order at work, it was also the site of great and intense extra-legal violence and terror. You were quite vulnerable in that setting. And so part of how they talked about why it was important to seek out arrest, to accept arrest and go to jail, was this was the way that you proved that you were no longer submissive to this system. You are no longer captured by its techniques of racial terror. And through that kind of dramatic performance, that dramatic refusal, activists could build solidarity with each other. They could spur on solidarity protests and sort of do movement building, right, centered within the Southern jail. And that I think, both this kind of outward purpose of signaling or communicating a really sweeping critique, and then this more inward focus of self-emancipation or inward within the movement of solidarity and movement building. I just think that that account has a very different texture. It's sort of normative or theoretical constellation looks quite different. And so it's just something that we can't see if we're so committed to the liberal model that all we can see is sort of what we're trained to look out for is reformist intent, or what we're trained to look out for is sort of signals of investment in the constitutional order as it exists.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating and makes things much more complex, right? And it would be interesting to think about what that means for activists today who might maybe use similar tactics, who might be using similar tactics to turn the courtroom into a political space and to use it as a forum to make their political claim that might otherwise not get heard. Another feature that is very often seen as central to civil disobedience is its symbolic and communicative character, and also its non-violence. And in the book, you show that that is one of the features of the civil disobedience campaign of the civil rights movement that was also developed in this kind of transnational context where the activists learned from anti-colonial struggles elsewhere, in particular from Gandhi, of course, and the Indian independence movement, how nonviolence works and how effective it can be. Now, I was wondering in the context of what you just said, where activists rejected the claim to legitimacy of the constitutional state and disputed that it has the democratic credentials it presented itself as having, and that were sort of bought by the white majority and by many political theorists. So they rejected that. I mean, that seems to open the way to let's say more militant, maybe even openly violent forms of resistance that would seem legitimate in such a context where the state just doesn't have a claim to your obedience because it systematically violates your freedom and subjects you to racial domination. Certainly in the colonial situation, there was always not only the non-violent form of anti-colonial struggle, but also of course in many cases openly violent and militant movements whose legitimacy today seems sort of out of the question because of the specificity of that situation. So was the question of violence sort of really settled in advance, or were there discussions in the civil rights movement about the legitimacy of violence under these circumstances? If it's really not a democratic state, then why restrain yourself in these ways? Was that also a tactical choice or principled one? There seem to be a lot of interesting issues at stake here.
That's a terrific question, and I think I'm going to answer it in a couple different ways. One of which is just to suggest, so one approach or one method that I use in the book is I sort of skirt questions of justification, in the sense that the kind of theorizing that I'm trying to do it isn't primarily centered on the question of when is violence legitimate, or what makes nonviolence legitimate or justifiable. And the reason that I avoid that language is that I think, it might just be, I think others have used that. So Candice Delma has used that language in a much more radical reinvention of what this kind of language of justification and legitimacy can really do to legitimate not just civil disobedience, but uncivil and sometimes violent disobedience. And so I'm not saying that that there aren't possibilities there, but I do think it's somewhat difficult working within this case to break that language from the kind of assumption that I was talking about, that there are democratic states and then there are others. The language of justification and legitimacy is at least to some extent tied, just within the traditions of theorizing that we're embedded in. It's just tied to particular kinds of states or particular theories of kinds of states. And so I think, for the activists, or the way that I think about it, the question that they posed isn't, at what threshold might something more than nonviolence be legitimate, but rather, what does nonviolence do? What does nonviolence of a certain form do when a mass of people are nonviolent in this way, when they resist nonviolently? What effects does that have as an inward matter, ethically on the self, and outwardly on relations with others and on institutions? And then, the flip side of that is what might violence do? And so beginning with a kind of theory of action, I think that helps preserve, first of all, a different way of thinking about nonviolence and its possibilities, but also its limitations. But it also makes sure that the conversation about mass nonviolence remains within the same framework or within the same conversation that other activists were talking about armed struggle, violent uprising. It's important to me to maintain the idea that this is a world of activists in a shared conversation about how to resist and how to transform structures of racial domination and colonization. And so because of that kind of framework about asking what these forms of action do, what effects they have in the world, I think we can see the ways that this question about violence and its uses, nonviolence and its uses, comes up again and again for civil rights activists. They're always in the midst of having this conversation with other activists. And there's no one answer. It's disputed the entire way through. So the earliest moment that I take up in the book is in the 1920s, as figures, within the African-American press and on the US side started to think about the case of Indian decolonization, but also something I don't talk about in the book, but that's also present in the press coverage is debates over Ireland. And so they're starting to have this conversation about what techniques of struggle might have purchase in the US. And that conversation never really dies down. It comes up again and again. And so so I don't think it's ever settled. That's one answer to your question. The other thing that I'd like to say about it, though, is that within that framework of thinking about what effects action has on the world, the way that the set of figures that I focus on thought about mass nonviolence is that it kind of has this twin face. So on the one hand, mass nonviolence cultivates this kind of practice of fearlessness that I was just talking about with respect to going to jail, this kind of performance of liberation. But then also outwardly, works on the world in certain ways. So by using techniques of disruption to intervene in the mode of direct action, to intervene in ongoing practices of domination, ongoing institutions, interrupt their functioning, which then creates the space for other citizens, particularly white citizens, to sort of reorient themselves toward what's going on, to take up the question anew about what their own investment is in the kind of revealed architecture of domination, and whether they want to be associated with it or whether they would like to be associated with the movement that's fighting it. And so there's a way in which for Martin Luther King, as for others, mass nonviolence held out this possibility of radically transforming those who are colonizers, occupiers, and dominators into citizens for the first time, into wholly different kinds of subjects. And for this set of figures, they felt that violent struggle cut off that possibility. I'm not totally 100% sure that they're right. It's something I'm still thinking through, but that's the way in which they answered the question. That was why nonviolence was important. So it has ethical stakes, but they're tied to political ones. It's about the kind of transformation of the worlds that they thought nonviolence specifically made possible, beyond just the kinds of things that any form of collective action, any form of resistance might make possible. And so the last thing I'll say on that is that there's a way that we can view that idea about transforming white Americans. We can view that as capitulating to a kind of white perspective. You know, they're sort of just appealing to the better angels of white people's nature or something. They're just trying to, you know, the kind of modern framework or modern critique of respectability politics. They're just trying to appeal in the right way so that white people won't feel so threatened, so that maybe they'll support them. I think that idea gives way too short shrift to the radical nature of this way of seeing nonviolence. I mean, for me, when you think about it, the ambition to transform people who are cast into the role of occupiers, colonizers, dominators, the kind of dominating citizens, to really think about what it would mean for them to become democratic citizens for the first time, to really inhabit relations of mutuality, equality, respect, and reciprocity with Black citizens. That's an ambition of radical proportion. And so, you know, even though I'm not necessarily wedded or fully on board with the answer that these activists came up with, I think I'm very invested in giving that radical perspective its due.
Yeah, no, and I think you do so very convincingly, and you show that nonviolence is not at all this, you know, kind of self-pacifying, merely symbolic practice. I mean, you show that it can be very disruptive, that you know, can involve forms of force and coercion that are often identified as violent, but that we should distinguish from violence. It's also, you know, probably interesting to think about the ways in which the civil rights movement was, of course, you know, very powerful, but only one way in which oppressed African Americans reacted to the fact of racial domination. Of course, there were, you know, Malcolm X and other, the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, etc., that had a different approach to violence. And there's discussion about how these different movements might have interacted. There's the so-called radical flank theory and stuff that comes back in the current discussion about, you know, climate protests and so on. But you know, you address that in the book, so I think people should look it up if they want to pursue this. Before I open up the Q&A, maybe one last question. I mean, one motivation I think you pursue in the book, and which is extremely interesting and politically important as well, is that you want to liberate current protest movements from the burden that is often imposed on them to somehow conform to the idealized and highly you know, non-factual standards that are associated with the civil rights movement. So maybe could you say just a word or two about, you know, breaking this kind of spell that especially conservative forces try to cast on current social movements by continuously invoking this idealized version of the civil rights movement that is completely sort of whitewashed and mellowed down?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was, you know, that was one thing that I mentioned earlier sort of how I got started on the project, and one of the things that I noted and that really really caused me to dig in on this project was the kind of way that the civil rights movement is invoked politically by conservatives, but not just by conservatives, by liberals, by almost everybody, even in cases where it doesn't seem to belong. So something that caught my attention when I was in graduate school and that I wrote a little bit about was the invocation of Martin Luther King to criticize Edward Snowden not accepting arrest. And it just seems to me that in a variety of ways that seems like an odd example to reach for. The cases just did not seem, they're just really incongruous. You've got a mass movement on the one hand and a lone whistleblower on the other. They just didn't seem to belong in the same conversation at all. And that was just one way in which the civil rights movement gets invoked, not just to sort of not just within conversations about Black Lives Matter or racial justice activism, but in all kinds of contexts, really whenever anybody engages in collective action or even, sometimes individual resistant action of any kind. And there's this kind of twin face, right? So on the one hand, a recurrent form of its invocation is to suggest that whoever they are, contemporary activists are not doing it right. They're not living up to their obligations. They're not behaving in the right ways. They're not behaving at all. They're way too disruptive. They're rowdy. They're rude. They're violent. All of these things. On the other hand, we also get really sort of opportunistic invocations of the civil rights movement for the legitimacy that it confers. So you have, in the past year, within the US, anti-lockdown protesters and anti-maskers basically saying that they are Rosa Parks or they're resisting in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. Because the example, domesticated though it is, just carries with it the idea that it is a legitimate form of resistance. And I think those two sides give us a picture of the problem, which is that as a symbol, it confers legitimacy, and yet the movements and the figures that are within the lineage of a Black freedom struggle, that are within the lineage of abolitionist and radical organizing, are almost always denied the legitimacy that it confers. And so one thing that I wanted to better understand was, how and why does the civil rights movement example start to circulate like this? How is it tied to the ways that the civil rights movement is evoked within philosophy? And how can we suggest, it's the kind of idiosyncratic aim in that I wanted to both suggest that the example of the movement is still exceptionally verdant, fertile ground for theorizing and radical thinking about tactics, ethics, and strategy and politics, while also suggesting that it isn't a model or a blueprint of any kind. It can't just be slapped down on other movements to suggest that, no, this is the way to do it. And so I think for me, the way of tying those two aims together is to think about, again, what uses did civil rights activists who undertook this kind of activity, who undertook civil disobedience, who committed to mass nonviolence, what did they think it was good for and why? What questions did it, what were the questions for which it provided an answer? And then at least we are in a position to say, to what extent are those questions still our questions? To what extent are those still the questions that activists themselves face? In what ways might they overlap with the kind of analysis of white supremacy and colonialism that this set of activists devised? And in what ways might it either be historically different now, or activists have room to differ, come up with their own social and political theories of what they're up against. And so sort of circling fully back to the title and this idea of seeing like an activist, I think that rather than being left with a model that is good for all times and places, where I end is by thinking about what would it mean to see like a contemporary activist. And truthfully, that might mean seeing quite differently than a civil rights activist. I think in most cases it would.
Great, thanks. So we'll open it up now, and there's already a couple of very interesting questions in the Q&A. So I'll just start with One of them with Sally's question. Sally has worked on issues of protest as well, and she asks, well, most accounts of civil disobedience assume that the disobedience is a violation of law as an effort to gain legal and political rights, etc. But what about organized resistance to social norms or cultural norms? For example, consider organized heterosexual sex boycott to protest rape culture. How does that fit within or in relation to civil disobedience?
That's a terrific question. I'm sure you have something to say to that, Robin, as well, as I think your own work speaks to this. But one thing that I think is one of the upshots of moving away from at least some corners of the liberal theory of civil disobedience is that some of it's quite legalistic. It really is very fixated on the idea of breaking a law, and in particular, though not always, when that law itself is what is under protest. And certainly that's one area of civil disobedience, but it need not be. It's certainly not the way that the idea of civil disobedience as a tactical form circulates amongst activists. It's usually much broader than that, as your question suggests, that violating social norms is a powerful way in which people undertake disobedient protest. And so within the example that I think through in the book, I think one of the ways that it matters is, thinking about, okay, like why does the legal framework become important for philosophers? And it's because, within certain kinds of states, citizens have this obligation to obey the law and maintain a system that overall guarantees rights. And so therefore, breaking the law becomes the thing. But for Black activists in the 60s and, Black activists in the US still, mass resistant action is still the kind of thing that gets you arrested, no matter whether you've broken a law or not. There is something disobedient within a white supremacist order of showing up en masse together. There's something already disobedient about that. And it tends to come with the threat of arrest. And so I think the example that you raised in the question is of that order too. Within patriarchal orders, white supremacist orders, heteronormative orders, there are not just laws, but norms and social conventions that are either officially or less than officially backed by the threat of force when you break them. And I think there's something meaningfully disobedient about breaking them.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you said. I mean, it's about usually it's breaking the law because of the status that law and the duty to obey the law has in our societies. In other social contexts, in our societies or in other societies where the law doesn't have that extremely central, some would say fetishized role, breaking a social norm might just be the functional equivalent of breaking a law in order to signal one's dissociation from the claim to obedience, right? And so I think, Sally, your example, if in a social context, the claim to loyalty and obedience is attached to a social norm rather than to one that is in formal terms a legal norm, that would just be the same or functionally equivalent kind of case. I think it's about what you want to communicate and the kind of level of or the force of dissociation that this signals. Okay, I'm going to take two questions together because two participants asked about this. What are the preconditions for civil disobedience to work? So, one participant, Gary, asked, it worked in India. It will not have worked in Hitler's Germany, probably. Under which conditions will it work? Also, someone called Nicodemism Sun asked whether in an authoritarian regime, civil disobedience would even be an option. So, how important is it that the order is somehow, even if it's only in the self-image of that order, sort of liberal, democratic, and not fully authoritarian?
It's a good question, and something that activists themselves debated quite a bit. So in the early part of the book, one thing that I consider is this debate in the early 20th century about what kind of white supremacist regime the US was. Was it actually, there was a real fear actually for Black activists that the US was not nearly enough like British colonialism, in that they had little hope that that full out racial terror, full out massacres wouldn't be the result of mass nonviolence, of basically declaring yourself en masse to be putting, setting aside the idea of taking up arms, that the US was much too brutal of a regime. And so, I mean, I think this was a really important question for activists themselves, but I think what that contest suggests is that the way that this might shake out wouldn't necessarily follow the lines that we might think, as in there's the set of liberal regimes in which civil disobedience works, and then there are these more brutal regimes where it won't. I think the history of mass nonviolent activism suggests that that's not always the case, and that it's just much more complicated than that. And so, empirical scholars who've been working on this have traced out many, many cases across the world in which mass nonviolence, including civil disobedience, has been operative and effective and a meaningful tool of resistance within various kinds of authoritarian and colonial regimes. With that said, I think the Cold War context of the US in the 1960s the importance of that can't be understated. And so what I think was operative, what historians of this period have argued, and that I think is right, is that operative in this period is a state, the US state as invested in an international image of democracy. And that has a certain restraining quality on the kinds of violence the state is willing to undertake, or the kinds of civilian violence the state is willing to either endorse or sort of tacitly accept. And so that kind of investment in positioning oneself globally as a particular kind of state, or the investment of ordinary citizens in thinking of themselves as affectively tied to a particular kind of state, of being democratic citizens, that's meaningful to people, and it does shape our behavior, and it does shape the way that states react to mass resistance. And so while I wouldn't be willing to draw any clean lines between, like, this place is too authoritarian, this place is democratic enough, those kinds of contextual questions, I think those kinds of contextual factors do matter quite a bit.
Thank you. The next question I want to pick up is by Erin Pineda. There's a tendency, I include myself in that, to always talk about the examples we sympathize with politically in discussions about civil disobedience. And the question is, well, why would anti-lockdown protests that claim to pick up the mantle of the civil rights movement, why would they not count as civil disobedience in that kind of tradition? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So that's a terrific question. And so to clarify, my point earlier wasn't necessarily that anti-lockdown protests wouldn't qualify as civil disobedience. I think part of the problem of the invocation of the civil rights movement as so tied to what legitimate civil disobedience looks like is that it rules out all kinds of things. It works as a kind of litmus test. Does it look like the civil rights movement? Yes or no. Answers the question, is it legitimate? Yes or no. Or even, is it civil disobedience? Yes or no. And I just think that the example, even more complex than it sometimes comes across, cannot possibly carry that kind of interpretive political weight. It can't relieve us of the burden of judging in each particular case what is happening, why is it happening, and what effect does it have on the world. So the anti-lockdown protests may well be a case of civil disobedience, and depending on how you articulate what's at stake in them, they may well be legitimate, depending on your account of legitimacy. So my point was more that the conversation about the particulars and the kind of question, what are activists doing and why? What kinds of effect do they want to have on the world and why, has to be asked anew in each case. So I'm not prepared, it's not an example that I've theorized, and I agree with Robin that there's a real risk in just taking up the movements and the claims and the causes that we ourselves endorse. And so I don't want to, it's not an example that I've fully thought through, but I think that there's still, the way that I would have to answer it is by thinking quite seriously about what anti-lockdown protesters wanted and why, and how they thought their actions, what effect they thought their actions would have on the world.
Yeah, thanks. So there's a question about public education and the way in which people learn about the civil rights movement. Maybe also more generally, you can ask this question about civil disobedience. So often these are, just like the civil rights movement, safely stored in the past, and we live in a completely different age. So they are heroes, but please don't try this at home. What do you think would have to change in public and higher education for, the example of the civil rights movement in all its complexity, to integrate it into also our current constellation, to learn from it, etc. I assume there are serious deficiencies in how this is taught at the moment. What would have to change there is the question by Abby.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think quite a bit would have to change, because I think one of the ways that I think, certainly in my own, I grew up in the US, so in my own thinking back on my own education, the way that I first encountered this example and what meanings it was supposed to have, it's already packaged within a narrative that sort of seems to predetermine the outcome, which is that there's a kind of, paired with sort of abolitionists and the Civil War and then the Civil Rights Movement. This is a kind of example that proves the perfection of American democracy, that proves the kind of gradual but kind of unceasing improvement, the greater and greater inclusion, forming a more and more perfect union. It's within a very sort of patriotic and ideological narrative always. And so that framework, might tell you that the civil rights movement is important and it's inspiring, and it might familiarize you with some of these figures, but it already preempts the question of what civil rights activists themselves were up to, why they thought it was meaningful to connect with anti-colonial activists, how they thought about Jim Crow. And it rules out in advance any other interpretation of their actions other than the kind of liberal one. And so, the short answer is that I think the entire way that racial history in the US is packaged and taught would have to change in order to make sense of the US as a longstanding racial state. That yes, we can characterize it as a constitutional democracy in some ways, but it's also a racial order over many centuries, and that is crucial to understanding what citizenship means here. It's crucial to understanding what activism means here, and is so central that it can't just be repackaged into a story about how this is, a democracy from 1776 slowly perfecting itself over time.
Thank you. We're reaching the end of our time here, but maybe one last question from Alexis, and I'm really sorry that I can't bring in all the questions. I try to spread it thematically a bit. So Alexis asks about the relation between organized and non-organized forms of protest. So civil disobedience is highly organized, especially in the civil rights movement. What about non-organized acts of disobedience, such as riots, for example? How do they fit into the framework?
It's a terrific question, and one that I don't have a full answer for, but I do think about it a little bit in the book, and I'm continuing to think about it now. And so one of the moves, or one of the things that I try to address in the book is how we think, how much more complicated our ideas of civil disobedience have to be if we don't take them as standalone symbolic events, but as events that are embedded within a movement and within a broader field of action that includes other tactical forms as well as spontaneous and less organized forms of action. And so it's not this standalone thing anymore. And so I look at the Birmingham campaign, and in particular, the kind of relationship that the planned civil disobedience had with more spontaneous forms of action that the civil disobedience was actually reliant on. So basically what organizers did is they planned for these marches to occur, and they basically delayed their starting so that a large enough gathering, a large enough crowd of spectators could gather. So there were all of these Black citizens of Birmingham who would just amass every day to see the see the march unfold and kind of see the drama unfold, but who were not recruited by the movement, had no formal ties to any of the movement organizations. But those crowds were a crucial part of the success of the movement, and more than the crowds themselves, which just added kind of to the spectacle and the power of the event. These thousands of people gathered rather than just 100 or fewer marchers. What happened day after day is that the spectators, who I call spectator demonstrators in the book to try to give them some, to kind of identify them as agents, as a meaningful part of the event and part of the movement, they would engage in skirmishes with the police every day. That the police would start to arrest marchers. The spectators would get angry and they'd throw bottles and bricks or jeer at the police, and engage the police in various kinds of fighting and struggle. And it was actually those spectators that actually drew the press, that drew the police repression, that got the movement the kind of national coverage that it needed. They were crucial. They were the crucial actors in that moment. And yet having to thread this needle to try to maintain the gains of the movement, powerful movement actors disavowed them right and left, said, they're not nonviolent, they're not part of the movement, you can't blame their violence you can't blame us for their violence. And so, that in the book is what I theorize as kind of the dilemma or the bind of organizing as mass Black activists within white supremacy, is this kind of constant threat that any kind of mass resistance from Black Americans is going to be seen and labeled as violent, even sort of putatively nonviolent. And so there's this constant boundary keeping work that then happens to try to protect the movement from these other tactical forms that nevertheless underwrote them, made them possible, and kept the movement relevant. And so it's a really complicated relationship for the activists themselves, as well as just for us to think about.